The clock on the living room wall ticked loudly, an unwelcome reminder of the silence that had settled between Jacob and Naomi. It was the kind of silence that didn't need words to be understood. Resentful, heavy, and stretching further every day. Jacob sat on the leather couch, scrolling through his phone, while Naomi folded laundry on the table, her movements methodical, almost robotic. It wasn't that she expected him to help. She had long since stopped asking for that. But the sharp comments that would inevitably come, she wasn't prepared for tonight. "You know," Jacob said, not even looking up, "if you took a little more pride in the way you dress, you wouldn't look so tired all the time." Naomi froze mid-fold, a sweater clutched in her hands. She didn't respond right away. What could she say that she hadn't already said? It wasn't the first time Jacob had made remarks like this, and it wouldn't be the last. "I've been working all day," she replied, keeping her voice calm, measured. "It's not exactly a fashion show around here." Jacob snorted, finally looking up. "Working where? At that charity? You spend more time giving away your energy to people who don't even appreciate it. If you put half that effort into," he waved vaguely, "keeping this place up, maybe you wouldn't feel so tired." The words hit her like they always did, a sharp jab to her chest. But this time, Naomi felt something else, a flicker of anger, a hint of something stronger than the quiet resignation she had grown used to carrying. She set the sweater down and looked at him, really looked at him. Jacob, with his tailored shirt and his neatly combed hair, always looking the part of the self-made man, the successful businessman who had pulled himself up by his bootstraps. That's how he always told the story, anyway. What he never told anyone, not his friends, not his colleagues, was how much of his success had come during the years Naomi had worked 2 jobs to keep their bills paid while he chased his dreams. How many nights she'd stayed up late, balancing their accounts, figuring out how to stretch his paycheck while he plotted the next big opportunity. She'd been proud to do it back then, to believe in him, in them. But now, that pride felt like a distant memory, replaced by this constant ache of being overlooked and undervalued. "I think the place looks fine," Naomi said quietly, her voice steady. "And I think I've done enough for today." Jacob's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "I'm just saying, Naomi, you could do more to match the life we've built. It's not like we're struggling anymore." That word stung more than any of the others. Jacob spoke about their success as if it had been entirely his doing, as if Naomi hadn't been there every step of the way. He always framed their life as something he had created for her, not something they had built together. And lately, it seemed like he saw her as less and less a partner and more like, what, a burden? An accessory? Naomi turned back to the laundry, swallowing the retort that burned at the back of her throat. She didn't want to argue. She was tired, not just from the day, but from this constant cycle of hurt and disappointment. It wasn't always like this, she reminded herself. There had been a time when Jacob had looked at her with admiration, even awe. A time when her humble beginnings had been a source of pride for him. When he'd tell anyone who would listen how Naomi's resilience and strength had inspired him. But that was years ago, before the money, before the success. Now, it seemed like her past was something Jacob wanted to forget, something he wanted her to erase, too. He didn't like when she talked about her childhood, about growing up in a tight-knit but struggling community. He rolled his eyes when she visited old friends or sent money to her family. "You're too sentimental," he'd say. "That part of your life is over. Focus on what's ahead." But what was ahead? More of this? More nights of feeling like she wasn't enough? Naomi glanced at her phone on the counter, the screen lighting up with a notification. It was a message from a number she didn't recognize, but the subject line caught her attention. Regarding the estate of Thomas Whitaker. Her breath caught. Thomas Whitaker, her grandfather. She hadn't heard his name in years. Something wrong? Jacob's voice cut into her thoughts, sharp and impatient. He was watching her now, his phone forgotten. "No," Naomi said quickly, brushing her hands on her jeans. "Just a message about something I need to take care of." He frowned but didn't press further, turning his attention back to his own screen. Naomi picked up her phone and slipped into the bedroom, her heart racing. Once the door was closed, she opened the message and read it carefully. The words blurred for a moment as a flood of emotions washed over her. Confusion, curiosity, and something she couldn't quite name. Her grandfather had always been a complicated figure in her life, a wealthy man who had disapproved of Naomi's mother's choices. He had distanced himself from the family years ago. Naomi had never expected anything from him, not his money, not his approval. But now, here was this message, summoning her to discuss the future of his estate. She didn't know what to think, what to feel. Naomi sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the screen. Part of her wanted to delete the message, to pretend it never came. She didn't need her grandfather's money. She didn't need anyone's money. But then her thoughts drifted back to Jacob, to the way he looked at her like she wasn't enough, to the way he spoke about her past like it was something to be ashamed of. The anger she had pushed down earlier flared up again, hotter this time. Maybe she didn't need the money, but she needed something. Something to remind herself of who she was before Jacob's constant criticisms made her doubt it. And maybe, just maybe, this was it. Naomi leaned against the door of her bedroom, still clutching her phone. The message about her grandfather stirred a whirlwind of memories. And as she stared out the window into the fading evening light, she let herself drift back to a time when life was simpler, though far from easy. Naomi grew up in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business, and the sense of community was both a blessing and a curse. Her childhood home was a modest, weathered structure with peeling paint and creaky floorboards. But to Naomi, it was a sanctuary. Her mother, Evelyn, was a force of nature, resilient, kind, and endlessly hardworking. Evelyn had raised Naomi and her younger brother, Elijah, on her own, juggling multiple jobs to keep food on the table and the lights on. Money was always tight, but there was no shortage of love. Naomi could still hear the sound of her mother's laugh, rich and warm, as she danced around the tiny kitchen while dinner simmered on the stove. Even now, Naomi could almost smell the aroma of her mother's chicken stew, a meal made from scraps that somehow always tasted like a feast. Evelyn had a knack for making the impossible seem manageable. She would sit at the kitchen table late into the night, her brow furrowed as she balanced the bills, while Naomi worked on her homework beside her. "We're not rich in money, baby," her mother would say, "but we're rich in spirit. And that's what counts." Naomi had believed her mother, clung to those words even when they didn't always feel true. Like the winter when the heater broke and they had to huddle together under piles of blankets to keep warm. Or the summer when the fridge broke down and they lived off canned goods until Evelyn could scrape together enough money for repairs. Through it all, Evelyn never let them feel like they were less than anyone else. But there was always a shadow over their home, one that came in the form of Naomi's grandfather, Thomas Whitaker. He was Evelyn's father, though he never acted like it. Thomas was a wealthy man who had made his fortune in real estate, owning half the properties in the county. But to Naomi and her brother, he was little more than a name, a specter that loomed over their lives. When Evelyn married a man Thomas disapproved of, a man he considered beneath their family status, Thomas had cut her off completely. He had washed his hands of her, declaring that if she wanted to live like common folk, she could do it without his help. Evelyn had been heartbroken, but defiant. She didn't need her father's money, she had said. She would make her own way, and she had. Naomi's father had passed away when she was just a baby, leaving Evelyn to raise her children alone. Thomas hadn't come to the funeral, hadn't offered so much as a condolence. Naomi had grown up hearing about him in hushed tones, her mother refusing to speak ill of him, but never hiding the pain his rejection had caused. The one time Naomi had met him was when she was 8 years old. She could still remember the day vividly. Evelyn had taken her and Elijah to a fancy hotel in the city where Thomas was staying. Naomi had been in awe of the grandeur, the marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, the uniformed staff bustling about. She had clutched her mother's hand tightly as they waited in the lobby, her heart pounding with nervous anticipation. When Thomas finally appeared, he was everything Naomi had imagined. Tall, imposing, with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see straight through her. He had looked at Evelyn with a mixture of disdain and indifference, his lips pressed into a thin line. "So," he had said, his voice cold and clipped, "these are the children." Evelyn had nodded, her grip on Naomi's hand tightening. "This is Naomi, and this is Elijah." Thomas had barely spared them a glance. He had exchanged a few terse words with Evelyn before turning on his heel and walking away. The encounter had lasted less than 5 minutes, but it had left an indelible mark on Naomi. She had felt small, insignificant, as though she were nothing more than an inconvenience to this man who was supposed to be her family. After that, Evelyn had stopped trying to reach out to Thomas. She had thrown herself even more fiercely into her work, determined to give her children the best life she could. And she had succeeded, at least in Naomi's eyes. Though they had little, they had always had each other, and that had been enough. As Naomi grew older, she carried her mother's lessons with her. She worked hard in school, earning scholarships that allowed her to attend college, where she studied business administration. She had dreams of building something, of creating a life that would make her mother proud. But even as she succeeded, she never forgot where she came from. She sent money home whenever she could, helped her brother get through trade school, and visited her mother often, savoring the comfort of their small home. When Naomi met Jacob, she had been working as a junior analyst at a small consulting firm. He had swept her off her feet with his ambition and charm, his promises of a bright future. At first, he had seemed to admire her determination, her resourcefulness. "You're amazing," he had told her once. "You've done so much with so little." But as the years went by and Jacob climbed the corporate ladder, his admiration began to fade, replaced by a subtle condescension. He would make little comments about her family, her upbringing, comments that stung more than she let on. "You don't have to send money home anymore," he had said once. "Your mom's fine. She doesn't need it." Naomi had tried to brush it off, to focus on the good in their life. But deep down, she had started to feel a fissure growing between them, one that only seemed to widen as Jacob's success grew. He seemed to view her past as a blemish, something to be hidden away, while Naomi saw it as the foundation of who she was. Sitting on the edge of the bed now, Naomi thought about her mother and the strength she had always shown. Evelyn had never let anyone make her feel small, not even Thomas Whitaker. Naomi realized she needed to channel that strength now. Whatever this message about her grandfather's estate meant, she would face it head on. Not for the money, she didn't care about that, but for the chance to reclaim a part of her story, a part that Jacob could never take away from her. Jacob closed his laptop with a sigh of frustration. The numbers weren't adding up, and his latest investment idea wasn't panning out the way he'd hoped. He leaned back in his leather office chair, staring at the ceiling. It wasn't supposed to be this hard. Success had always come naturally to him, or at least that's how he liked to think of it. He glanced out the window of his home office, his eyes catching a glimpse of Naomi walking across the backyard, carrying a basket of laundry. She was wearing one of those old, faded dresses he hated. The fabric clung to her figure in a way that hinted at her natural beauty, but it was impossible for him to focus on that when she insisted on dressing like someone who didn't belong in the life they'd built together. It annoyed him. She could afford better now. He'd made sure of that. They weren't scraping by anymore, not like in the early years of their marriage. Back then, her thriftiness had seemed charming, even admirable. But now, Jacob saw it as stubbornness, a refusal to let go of a past he had worked so hard to leave behind. Jacob prided himself on being a self-made man. He had grown up in a middle-class family, not poor but certainly not rich. His parents had instilled in him the importance of hard work and ambition, values he carried with him through college and into his career. He liked to think of himself as someone who had earned every dollar, every promotion, every accolade through sheer determination and grit. In his mind, Naomi didn't fully understand what it meant to strive for something better. Yes, she had worked hard to put herself through school, and yes, she had supported him in the early days of their marriage. But she didn't seem to grasp the importance of appearances, of projecting an image of success. It wasn't just about money. It was about respect, about being taken seriously in the world. Jacob believed that perception was everything, and Naomi's refusal to embrace that frustrated him endlessly. He had tried to help her see it his way, but she always pushed back, insisting that she was happy the way she was. Happy wasn't good enough for Jacob. He wanted more success, more recognition, more of everything. He had grown his business from the ground up, navigating corporate politics and outmaneuvering competitors. He had made connections with influential people, attending lavish events where appearances mattered more than anything else. But Naomi? She didn't care about any of that. She was content to volunteer at her charity, spending her days helping people who, in Jacob's eyes, didn't want to help themselves. It baffled him. Why pour so much time and energy into people who weren't willing to climb the ladder of success? He didn't understand it, and more than that, he resented it. Jacob didn't like to think of himself as shallow, but the truth was he cared deeply about how others saw him. He had worked too hard to be dismissed or overlooked, and he wanted a wife who reflected the life he had built. Someone who turned heads when she walked into a room. Someone who made people think, wow, Jacob really has it all. Instead, Naomi seemed determined to live as if nothing had changed. She still sent money to her family, still shopped at discount stores, still spoke with a humility that Jacob found almost embarrassing. He had stopped bringing her to networking events because he hated the way people looked at her. Not with disdain, but with pity. He could feel it in the way they smiled, the way their eyes flicked to him with a question he didn't want to answer. Why is she so ordinary? Jacob hated that question. He hated the way it made him feel, as if his success wasn't enough, as if he had failed in some way. It wasn't fair. He had worked too hard to feel this way in his own marriage. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that Naomi was holding him back, that her refusal to change was a reflection on him. He tried to push these thoughts aside, to remind himself of the good things about Naomi. She was kind, thoughtful, and loyal in a way he knew he probably didn't deserve. She had stood by him during the lean years, never once complaining about the long hours he worked or the risks he took. But now, as they stood on the cusp of a life most people could only dream of, Jacob found himself wishing she would evolve with him. Sometimes, late at night, he wondered if he had made a mistake. Maybe they had been too young when they got married, too inexperienced to know what they really wanted. He had loved Naomi once, fiercely and without question. But now, that love felt complicated, weighed down by resentment and unmet expectations. Jacob wasn't blind to his own flaws. He knew he could be demanding, that his standards were often impossible to meet. But wasn't that what success required? High standards? Unwavering ambition? He told himself that his criticism of Naomi came from a place of love, that he only wanted her to be the best version of herself. But deep down, he knew that wasn't entirely true. The truth was Jacob was scared of being judged, of not being enough, of losing the respect of the people he had worked so hard to impress. And Naomi, with her quiet contentment and refusal to play the game, was a constant reminder of his own insecurities. He hated admitting that to himself, so he buried the thought under layers of rationalization. Naomi was the one who needed to change, not him. She was the one clinging to the past, to values that no longer fit their life. If she would just listen to him, just trust him, everything would be fine. Jacob glanced at the clock. Naomi would be coming inside soon, and he didn't feel like arguing tonight. He didn't want to fight with her. It drained him in a way that even his worst days at work couldn't. But he also didn't know how to bridge the growing distance between them. He wanted to be proud of his wife, wanted to show her off to the world, but he didn't know how to ask for that without sounding like a monster. Maybe he was a monster. The thought lingered, unwelcome and unsettling, as Jacob poured himself a glass of scotch and sat back down at his desk. The truth was Jacob loved Naomi, or at least he thought he did. But his love was tangled up in so many other things: pride, insecurity, ambition. And as much as he wanted to believe they could find their way back to each other, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between them, something he didn't know how to fix. Jacob sighed, rubbing his temples. He would figure it out eventually, he told himself. He always did, but for now he would focus on what he knew best: building, achieving, succeeding. And maybe, just maybe, Naomi would catch up. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the blinds as Naomi sat in the lawyer's office, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The room smelled of polished wood and faintly of lemon cleaner, a subtle testament to the wealth her grandfather had accumulated over his lifetime. Despite the luxurious surroundings, Naomi felt out of place, like an intruder in a world that wasn't hers. Across from her sat Mr. Greer, a bespectacled man with thinning hair and a calm demeanor. He had introduced himself as her grandfather's attorney, a man who had worked with Thomas Whitaker for over 30 years. Now, he was the bearer of news Naomi never anticipated receiving. To say Mr. Whitaker was a private man would be an understatement, Mr. Greer said, adjusting his glasses as he sifted through a stack of papers on his desk. He valued control, precision, and legacy. While he may not have been forthcoming during his life, he gave careful thought to what he wanted to leave behind. Naomi nodded silently, unsure of how to respond. Her heart thudded in her chest as she waited for him to continue. His will stipulates that you, Naomi Whitaker Hayes, are to inherit the majority of his estate, including his primary residence, the business assets of Whitaker Realty, and liquid funds amounting to... He paused, glancing up at her briefly before saying the number. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. Roughly $35 million. The number hit her like a physical blow. For a moment, she thought she had misheard, her mind struggling to process the enormity of it. $35 million? It was unfathomable, unreal. She blinked rapidly, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. I don't understand, Naomi stammered, shaking her head. Why me? He barely even acknowledged me or my family when he was alive. Mr. Greer offered her a small, sympathetic smile. Mr. Whitaker was not a man who expressed himself easily, especially when it came to matters of family. But it was clear to me, in the time I worked with him, that he held a deep regret for how he treated your mother, and by extension, you and your brother. While he didn't reconcile with you in life, he sought to make amends in death. Naomi's stomach churned with conflicting emotions: shock, anger, confusion, and an odd sense of validation. Her grandfather, the man who had dismissed her mother as a failure, who had barely spared her a glance during their one and only meeting, had left her a fortune that could change the course of her life. It didn't make sense. How could a man who had so coldly turned his back on their family now attempt to make amends with something as impersonal as money? What are the conditions? She asked, her voice hesitant. A man like Thomas Whitaker wouldn't give away his fortune without strings attached. Mr. Greer nodded as if anticipating the question. There are a few stipulations. First, you must take on an active role in managing Whitaker Realty for at least 1 year. He believed that his legacy should remain within the family, and he wanted you to have the opportunity to shape its future. Second, you are to reside in his primary home in the city for the duration of that year. This is non-negotiable. Naomi's head swam with the weight of what was being asked of her. Moving to the city? Running a real estate empire? She had no experience in that world, no knowledge of how to navigate the complexities of a business Thomas had spent decades building. Yet, as overwhelming as it seemed, a part of her felt intrigued. This was an opportunity, one that could redefine everything she thought she knew about herself and her place in the world. I need time to think about this, she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. Of course, Mr. Greer said, sliding a folder across the desk toward her. Take these documents with you. They outline the details of the estate and the conditions of the inheritance. If you choose to accept, I'll need your formal agreement within 30 days. Naomi nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she took the folder. She left the office in a daze, the weight of the revelation settling over her like a heavy blanket. The drive home was a blur. Naomi barely registered the passing scenery, her mind consumed with questions and doubts. How would she tell Jacob? Should she tell Jacob? She could already picture his reaction. Initial disbelief, followed by excitement, and then, inevitably, an eagerness to take control. As she pulled into the driveway of their suburban home, Naomi felt a pang of apprehension. Jacob was sitting on the front porch, his phone in hand, a scowl on his face. He looked up as she approached, his expression shifting to mild curiosity. "Where were you?" he asked as she stepped out of the car. "You didn't say you'd be out this long." Naomi hesitated, clutching the folder tightly against her chest. "I had a meeting," she said vaguely, sidestepping the question. "It was something about my grandfather's estate." Jacob raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. "Oh, really? What kind of meeting?" She hesitated, debating how much to share. It was just the lawyer going over some details. Nothing's decided yet. Jacob's gaze flicked to the folder in her hands, his curiosity deepening. Is there something I should know? What's in there? Naomi felt a surge of protectiveness rise within her. This was her decision, her moment, and she wasn't ready to let Jacob dictate the terms. Like I said, it's not decided, she replied firmly. Let me process this first. Jacob frowned, but didn't press further, though Naomi could tell he was holding back. She brushed past him, her heart racing as she headed inside. That night, Naomi lay awake, staring at the ceiling as Jacob slept beside her. Her mind raced with possibilities, with fears and hopes she could barely articulate. This inheritance wasn't just money. It was a chance to reclaim a part of her identity, to step into a world her mother had been shut out of. It was an opportunity to prove, to herself and to everyone else, that she was capable of so much more than what Jacob or anyone else saw in her. But with that opportunity came risk. What would this mean for her marriage? For her life as she knew it? And most importantly, could she trust Jacob to stand by her without letting his ambition overshadow her own dreams? Naomi sighed, turning onto her side and closing her eyes. She didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was certain. Her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Naomi stood in the foyer of her grandfather's sprawling mansion, its grandeur both intimidating and surreal. The marble floors gleamed under the light of an enormous chandelier, and the air carried a faint scent of polished wood and old money. It was a far cry from the modest home where she'd grown up, and she felt a pang of guilt as she thought of her mother, who had spent her entire life just trying to make ends meet. Naomi didn't know whether to feel grateful or resentful as she stepped further inside, her heels clicking softly against the pristine floor. A staff member approached, a woman in her 50s with a kind smile and a professional demeanor. "Welcome, Mrs. Hayes," she said. "My name is Evelyn, Mr. Whitaker's personal assistant. I'll be helping you settle in and navigate your new responsibilities." Naomi nodded, her mind racing. This was it, the beginning of a journey she hadn't chosen but couldn't walk away from. She was stepping into a world that had always felt closed off to her, a world her mother had been deliberately excluded from. The weight of her decision pressed down on her, but alongside it was a flicker of determination. She would make this work, not just for herself, but for the legacy her mother had been denied. The first few weeks were overwhelming. Naomi spent long hours in the Whitaker Realty office, poring over financial reports, meeting with department heads, and learning the intricacies of the business. At first, she felt out of her depth. The language of real estate was foreign to her, and the pressure to prove herself was immense. She was acutely aware of the skepticism from some of the senior staff, who viewed her as an outsider with no experience. "Don't worry about what they think," Evelyn had said one afternoon as they reviewed documents in the study. "Your grandfather chose you for a reason. You just have to show them what you're capable of." Naomi took those words to heart. She threw herself into her work, spending late nights studying the industry and asking questions when she didn't understand something. Slowly but surely, she began to find her footing. She realized that many of the skills she had honed over the years, budgeting, problem-solving, and managing people, were transferable. Her natural empathy and ability to connect with others also proved invaluable in building relationships with employees and clients. But it wasn't just about learning the business. Naomi also started to think about how she could use her position to make a difference. One of the first things she did was set up a scholarship fund for underprivileged youth in her hometown, naming it after her mother. She wanted to honor Evelyn's resilience and ensure that other kids like her had opportunities to succeed. When she announced the initiative at a company meeting, she was met with mixed reactions. Some applauded her vision, while others questioned the practicality of such a move. Naomi stood her ground, calmly explaining her reasoning and outlining how the fund would be financed. By the end of the meeting, even her skeptics had to admit she had thought it through. As Naomi grew more confident in her role, she began to change in other ways as well. She started to embrace her new lifestyle, not out of vanity, but as a way of reclaiming her sense of self-worth. She bought clothes that made her feel powerful and confident, updating her wardrobe with tailored suits and elegant dresses that reflected her evolving identity. She began attending networking events and charity galas, not just as a participant, but as someone people sought out to speak with. At one such event, Naomi found herself in conversation with a group of influential business leaders. They asked her about her background, and for the first time, she didn't shy away from talking about her humble beginnings. "I grew up in a small town," she said, her voice steady. "My mother worked multiple jobs to support us. She taught me the value of hard work and compassion, and those lessons have stayed with me every step of the way. I wouldn't be here without her." Her honesty resonated with the group, and she left the event feeling a newfound sense of pride. She realized that her past wasn't something to be hidden or ashamed of. It was a part of her story, a testament to her strength and resilience. Meanwhile, her relationship with Jacob grew increasingly strained. He visited her occasionally at the mansion, but their conversations were stilted and filled with tension. Jacob was clearly uncomfortable with the shift in their dynamic. He no longer held the position of power in their marriage, and it showed in the way he spoke to her. "You've changed," he said one evening as they sat in the grand dining room. His tone wasn't admiring, it was accusatory. Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Of course I've changed, Jacob. I'm learning and growing. Isn't that what you always wanted?" He frowned, swirling the wine in his glass. "I just feel like you're different, like you're leaving me behind." Naomi's heart sank, but she refused to let his words diminish her progress. "I'm not leaving you behind," she said gently but firmly. "But I can't stay the same person I was either. I need to grow, Jacob, for myself." He didn't respond, and the silence between them spoke volumes. Despite the challenges in her personal life, Naomi continued to thrive professionally. She implemented new policies at Whitaker Realty that emphasized sustainability and community engagement, earning her respect and admiration from employees and clients alike. She also reconnected with old friends and family members, using her resources to support causes close to her heart. One of the most poignant moments came when she returned to her hometown to announce a redevelopment project aimed at revitalizing the area. Standing in front of a crowd that included childhood friends and neighbors, Naomi felt a swell of emotion. "This town shaped me," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It taught me the value of perseverance and community. I want to get back to the place that gave me so much." The applause was deafening, and Naomi felt a deep sense of fulfillment. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly at peace with herself. By the end of the year, Naomi had transformed in ways she hadn't thought possible. She was no longer the woman who folded under Jacob's criticism or second-guessed her worth. She had reclaimed her identity, not just as Thomas Whitaker's heir, but as a strong, capable woman who could stand on her own. And as she looked ahead to the future, she knew that her journey was only just beginning. Naomi stepped into the mansion's sunlit study, a stack of papers in hand. The house felt quieter than usual, almost stifling in its stillness. Jacob was already there, lounging in one of the leather armchairs near the fireplace. He had arrived the previous evening for one of his infrequent visits, and Naomi couldn't help but notice how out of place he seemed in her world now, more so than she had expected. He glanced up from his phone and frowned, his expression a mixture of impatience and suspicion. "You've been busy," he remarked, gesturing toward the documents in her hand. His tone was casual, but Naomi could feel the edge in it. "I have," she replied, her voice even. "There's always something to take care of." Jacob leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "So, what is it this time? Another charity project? Another feel-good initiative that makes you look like the benevolent heir?" Naomi stiffened. She placed the papers on the desk, keeping her back to him for a moment to compose herself. When she finally turned to face him, her expression was calm, but her eyes betrayed her frustration. "Why do you always dismiss the work I'm doing?" she asked. "These projects matter. They're making a real difference in people's lives." Jacob scoffed, shaking his head. "You're not running a business, Naomi. You're running a nonprofit disguised as a business. Do you have any idea how much potential profit you're leaving on the table with all these community investments and sustainability initiatives? This company could be 10 times more lucrative if you focused on what actually matters." Naomi folded her arms across her chest. "And what actually matters, Jacob? Making more money? Exploiting every opportunity? no matter the cost? Yes, he snapped, his frustration boiling over. That's how success works, Naomi. That's how you stay on top. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Naomi's jaw tightened as she stared at him, the man she had once believed in so completely. Is that all you care about? Money? Staying on top? Jacob stood, his movements abrupt. Don't twist this around. You're acting like you're better than me just because you inherited all of this, he said, gesturing around the room. You didn't earn it, Naomi. It was handed to you. And now you're acting like you're some kind of saint, throwing money at people who don't deserve it while ignoring the bigger picture. Naomi felt the words hit her like a slap. Her voice, when it came, was low and trembling with restrained anger. You think I didn't earn this? You think everything I've done, every decision I've made, every late night I've spent learning this business doesn't count because I didn't build it from scratch? That says more about you than it does about me. Jacob hesitated, as if realizing he had gone too far, but the damage was done. Naomi continued, her voice rising. Do you even hear yourself, Jacob? You're so obsessed with wealth and power that you can't see anything else. You don't care about the people this money could help, the lives it could change. All you care about is how it benefits you. That's not true, he shot back, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. I care about us, about our future. Our future, Naomi repeated, incredulous. You haven't cared about our future in years. You only care about your ego, about how I make you look. You want me to be someone I'm not because you're ashamed of who I am. Jacob's face hardened, his jaw clenching as he stared at her. Maybe I wouldn't feel that way if you didn't act like you were still some small-town girl trying to save the world. You're living in a fantasy, Naomi. The real world doesn't work like that. Naomi shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. You don't understand anything about me, do you? About where I come from, or why I do what I do. And you don't want to. All you see is a version of me that fits into your narrative, and when I don't match it, you tear me down. Jacob took a step toward her, his voice softening. Naomi, that's not fair. I've always supported you. No, Jacob, she interrupted, her voice firm. You supported the version of me that didn't challenge you. The one who stayed in the background and let you take the spotlight. But I'm not that person anymore, and I won't apologize for it. Jacob stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Naomi felt her chest heaving with the effort of holding back years of frustration and pain. Then Jacob spoke, his voice low and cold. You think you're better than me now, don't you? Because you have all of this. Because you don't need me anymore. Naomi took a deep breath, her voice steady and clear. This was never about who needed who, Jacob. It was about respect. And somewhere along the way, you stopped respecting me. You stopped seeing me as your partner and started seeing me as an accessory. That's not a marriage. That's control. Jacob's face twisted with anger, but he didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair and stormed out of the room, leaving Naomi standing there, her hands trembling. In the days that followed, the tension between them only grew. Jacob became increasingly distant, retreating to his own world of business and ambition. Naomi, meanwhile, threw herself into her work, finding solace in the projects that brought her joy and fulfillment. But the confrontation had left a crack in their relationship that felt impossible to mend. Naomi began to see Jacob in a different light, his true nature exposed in ways she could no longer ignore. The man she had once loved, the man she had believed in, was consumed by his own insecurities and selfish desires. And as much as it pained her to admit it, she realized that she could no longer build her future around someone who refused to grow with her. The turning point came one evening when Naomi overheard a conversation Jacob was having on the phone. He was in the study, speaking loudly and angrily, unaware that she was standing just outside the door. I don't know how much longer I can deal with this, he was saying. She's impossible to reason with. If she keeps making these ridiculous decisions, the company's going to tank. And don't even get me started on how she's running the household. It's like she's trying to embarrass me. Naomi felt her chest tighten as she listened. She had heard enough. Quietly, she turned and walked away, her heart heavy but resolute. It was clear now that Jacob didn't see her as an equal, as a partner. He saw her as a problem to be solved, an obstacle to his vision of success. That night, as she lay in bed, Naomi made a decision. She would no longer allow Jacob's negativity and selfishness to define her life. She had worked too hard, grown too much, to let him drag her back into the shadows. She deserved better, better from him, better from herself. And as she stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with possibilities, she realized that this wasn't just a turning point for their relationship. It was a turning point for her, a moment to reclaim her power, her voice, and her future. Whether Jacob chose to join her on that journey or not was up to him. But Naomi knew one thing for certain. She was done waiting for him to catch up. Jacob sat in his office, the harsh glow of his computer screen illuminating his face. The once organized desk was now cluttered with files, notes, and empty coffee mugs, a far cry from the pristine image he'd always maintained. He scrolled through yet another set of disappointing financial reports, his frustration mounting with every line. His latest investment, a high-risk tech startup, had failed spectacularly, and the fallout was hitting harder than he'd anticipated. His savings were dwindling, his business partners were growing wary, and the whispers of his declining success had begun circulating in the circles he once dominated. For the first time in years, Jacob felt powerless. He was no longer the confident, self-made man he had prided himself on being. Instead, he was a man grasping at straws, desperate to hold on to the image he had carefully constructed. Adding to his mounting stress was the strained state of his marriage. Since their explosive argument in Naomi's study weeks earlier, the tension between them had grown unbearable. Jacob had tried to compartmentalize his frustrations, blaming Naomi for their growing rift. But deep down, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he had contributed to their unraveling, that his words, his actions, his relentless need for control had pushed her further away. One evening, Jacob decided to attend a networking event in the city, hoping to reignite his faltering connections. He arrived in his usual sharp suit, his smile practiced and confident. But as he moved through the room, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries, he couldn't ignore the subtle shift in the way people treated him. The warmth and admiration he was used to had been replaced with polite indifference, even condescension. Jacob, one of his former colleagues said, clapping him on the shoulder, "Haven't seen you in a while. Heard things have been challenging lately." Jacob forced a laugh, his grip tightening on his glass of scotch. "Business is full of ups and downs," he replied smoothly. "You know how it is?" The man nodded, but his expression was skeptical. "Of course. Still, it must be nice to have Naomi's resources to fall back on. I mean, Whitaker Realty is practically a gold mine, isn't it?" Jacob's jaw tightened. He hated how casually people brought up Naomi's inheritance, as if it were the only thing that mattered. "She's doing well with it," he said tersely, excusing himself before the conversation could continue. He spent the rest of the evening trying to salvage his pride, but the whispers followed him wherever he went. By the time he left, his confidence was in shreds. Back at home, Jacob poured himself another drink and sat in the darkened living room, the weight of his failures pressing down on him. He thought about Naomi, about how much she had changed, how she had grown into someone he barely recognized. But as much as he tried to blame her for their distance, he couldn't ignore the voice in his head that told him the truth. He had failed her. In the beginning, he had admired Naomi's strength, her resilience, her unwavering belief in him. But somewhere along the way, his own insecurities had taken over. Her humility had become a source of embarrassment for him. Her compassion a weakness he couldn't understand. And now, as she thrived in her new role, he was left floundering, unable to reconcile the woman she had become with the image he had constructed in his mind. Jacob set his glass down and leaned back, closing his eyes. Memories flooded his mind. Naomi working late into the night to support his dreams, her laughter filling their tiny apartment during their early years of marriage, the way she used to look at him with pride and love. He realized, with a pang of regret, that he had taken her for granted. He had allowed his own ambition to overshadow everything else, including the woman who had stood by him through it all. The breaking point came a few weeks later, when Jacob received a call from one of his business partners, informing him that their company was pulling out of a joint venture. It was the last in a series of professional setbacks, and Jacob knew he was in trouble. He had over-leveraged himself, gambling on high-risk deals that hadn't paid off. Now, with his savings nearly depleted and his reputation in tatters, he was facing financial ruin. Desperate, Jacob turned to Naomi. He found her in the garden, tending to the flowers she had planted shortly after moving into the mansion. She looked serene, her hands covered in soil, her face glowing in the afternoon sun. For a moment, Jacob hesitated, struck by the stark contrast between her calm strength and his own unraveling. "Naomi," he said, his voice strained. She looked up, her expression cautious but not unkind. "What is it, Jacob?" she asked, brushing her hands on her apron. "I need your help," he admitted, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Things aren't going well with my business. I've had some setbacks, big ones, and I need a loan, just something to get me back on my feet." Naomi's eyes softened, but her expression remained unreadable. "A loan?" she repeated, her tone measured. "Yes," Jacob said, desperation creeping into his voice. "I wouldn't ask if it weren't serious. I just need enough to stabilize things. You've got the resources now. You could make this happen." Naomi studied him for a long moment, her gaze piercing. "Jacob," she said finally, her voice calm but firm, "do you realize what you're asking me? You want me to bail you out of the same cycle of ambition and recklessness that's been driving us apart." Jacob opened his mouth to protest, but she held up a hand. "This isn't just about the money," she continued. "This is about you, about the way you've treated me, the way you've treated yourself. You've been so consumed by your need to succeed that you've lost sight of everything else. Your integrity, your relationships, your own sense of worth." Her words cut deep, and Jacob felt a pang of shame. But he couldn't stop himself from pushing back. "I'm trying to fix things, Naomi," he said, his voice rising. "I'm trying to get back on track. Isn't that worth supporting?" Naomi sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "Jacob, I've always supported you. I believe in you when no one else did. But I can't keep enabling you to chase something that's only hurting you and us." Jacob stared at her, his mind racing. He wanted to argue, to convince her that she was wrong. But deep down, he knew she wasn't. She had seen through him, through all the layers of pride and denial he had built around himself. "I need time," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Time to figure things out." Naomi nodded, her expression softening. "Take the time you need, Jacob. But understand that this isn't just about fixing your business. It's about fixing yourself." Over the next few months, Jacob began a journey of self-reflection. He sought out therapy, something he had always dismissed as unnecessary. For the first time, he confronted the insecurities and fears that had driven his actions. The fear of failure, the fear of being seen as less than enough. He realized how much of his identity had been tied to external validation, to the approval of others. It wasn't an easy process. Jacob had to face uncomfortable truths about himself, about the ways he had hurt Naomi and undermined their marriage. He wrote her a letter, pouring out his regrets and taking full responsibility for his actions. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He knew that was something he had to earn. At the same time, he began to rebuild his professional life, focusing on smaller, more sustainable ventures. He reached out to old colleagues, not to ask for favors, but to rebuild the bridges he had burned. Slowly but surely, he started to regain a sense of purpose, not the relentless ambition that had driven him before, but a quieter, more grounded sense of fulfillment. Months later, Jacob stood in the garden of Naomi's mansion, the same spot where they had spoken about his downfall. Naomi was there, tending to her flowers as she always did. She looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable. "I wanted to thank you," Jacob said, his voice steady, "for being honest with me, even when it wasn't easy, and for giving me the space to figure things out." Naomi smiled faintly, nodding. "I'm glad you're finding your way, Jacob." He hesitated, then added, "I know I still have a lot to prove. To you, and to myself. But I'm ready to do the work." Naomi studied him for a moment, then reached out to brush a stray petal from his sleeve. "We'll see, Jacob," she said softly. "We'll see." For the first time in years, Jacob felt a glimmer of hope, not for the man he used to be, but for the man he was becoming. Naomi stood in the hallway of her grandfather's mansion, the soft light of early morning filtering through the tall windows, casting long shadows on the polished floors. The house was quiet, but there was a hum of anticipation in the air, an energy she couldn't quite name but knew had been building inside her for months. She had spent the last year transforming her life in ways she never thought possible, and though the journey had been tumultuous, she finally felt like she was on the right path. Her growth had been gradual at first, a steady accumulation of knowledge, skills, and confidence. But lately, Naomi had felt a shift within herself, something deeper, more profound. It wasn't just the inheritance or the business success. It was the realization that she had carved out a place for herself, that she had built something of value not only for her grandfather's estate, but for herself, too. She had always been the quiet, supportive partner in her marriage, but now, she was emerging as a woman who could stand on her own, whose worth wasn't defined by her husband's success or failure. She was no longer the girl who had been swept up by Jacob's charm and ambition. She was the woman who had learned to embrace her own power, her own voice. And with that came the difficult but necessary realization that her relationship with Jacob might not survive her transformation. The first time Naomi truly understood the depth of her change was during a company meeting at Whitaker Realty. She had just finished presenting a proposal for a new community development project, one that would revitalize several underfunded neighborhoods while incorporating sustainable, eco-friendly practices. The room was filled with her team, some of whom had been with the company for decades, and she could feel their skepticism radiating in the air. Many of them were used to the old ways, no-nonsense business deals, high profits, and little concern for anything outside of the bottom line. But Naomi stood firm. She had worked too hard to let her ideas be dismissed out of hand. She had spent countless hours researching, strategizing, and networking to ensure this proposal wasn't just a pipe dream, but a viable, impactful initiative. When she finished speaking, the room was silent. The weight of the moment hung in the air like an unspoken question. Would they accept her vision, or would they let the old ways dictate their future? Finally, one of the senior managers, a gruff man in his 50s, spoke up. "It's ambitious, Naomi, but we've always focused on making money first. What makes you think this will work?" Naomi took a deep breath and looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each person who was watching her. "Because it's not just about money," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "It's about creating something that lasts, something that gives back to the community and sets us apart from the competition. If we continue to chase profits without considering the bigger picture, we'll be left behind. This is the future of business, not the past." The manager grunted, clearly not convinced. But Naomi wasn't finished. "I know you all have your doubts, but I've done my research. I've spoken with local leaders, community organizers, and environmental experts. I believe this project will not only be profitable, but will also elevate Whitaker Realty as a company that cares about the world it operates in. And if we can prove that, we'll gain the kind of loyalty and respect that money alone can't buy." A tense silence followed. Naomi could feel the weight of their skepticism, but she refused to back down. Finally, the senior manager nodded. "We'll give it a shot," he muttered. "But you'd better be right." Naomi smiled inwardly. The approval wasn't a win just for her proposal. It was a win for everything she had worked for. It was the moment she realized that she had earned her place at the table. No longer did she have to prove her worth to anyone, least of all her colleagues. They were beginning to see her as more than just the heir to Thomas Whitaker's legacy. They were starting to recognize her for her own abilities, her vision, and her potential. But as Naomi's professional life flourished, her personal life became more complicated. Jacob's behavior had only grown more erratic and self-centered. He had withdrawn from the relationship, leaving her to fend for herself as he spiraled further into his own struggles. The weight of his failures, the business losses, the pressure to maintain an image of success, had been more than he could handle. But Naomi could no longer be the person who picked up the pieces of his broken ambitions. She had tried to help him, had tried to support him through his downturn, but it had become clear that he was unwilling to change. His arrogance, his need for control, and his obsession with his image were things she couldn't fix. They were things he had to confront on his own. And so, as Naomi continued to grow and change, she realized that she had outgrown Jacob, not just as a partner in business, but as a partner in life. The turning point came one evening when Jacob, in his usual self-centered way, suggested that Naomi use her newfound wealth to bail him out of his latest financial crisis. "You've got the resources, Naomi," he said, his tone laden with entitlement. "If you don't help me, we'll lose everything. I need your support." Naomi sat across from him at the dining table, her hands clenched into fists. Her heart raced, a combination of anger and disbelief swirling within her. For years, she had tried to build a life with him, had sacrificed her own ambitions and desires to prop up his ego, his dreams. But now, sitting here, listening to him speak as though she existed solely to fix his problems, Naomi realized something that hit her like a thunderclap. She had given everything she had to this marriage, but it wasn't enough. Jacob had never truly seen her for who she was. He had never respected her for her intelligence, her work ethic, her ability to make something of herself. He had always seen her as an accessory, a means to an end. He had loved the idea of her, strong, supportive, but still subservient to his needs and desires. "Jacob," Naomi said, her voice trembling but steady, "I've given you everything. My time, my energy, my heart. But I can't keep doing this. I can't keep sacrificing my own growth, my own happiness, just to prop you up. You have to figure this out on your own." Jacob's face twisted in anger, his pride bruised. "You think you can just walk away from everything? From me? You're nothing without me, Naomi. You wouldn't have this life, this money, if it weren't for me." Naomi stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. "I would have had it all, Jacob. I had it in me all along. This life isn't yours to give me. It's mine to create." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Jacob sitting there, stunned and speechless. In the weeks that followed, Naomi began to make difficult choices. She had once dreamed of a life with Jacob, of a partnership that was built on mutual respect and shared ambition. But now, she knew that dream wasn't hers to chase anymore. She had spent too many years in a relationship that stifled her, that pushed her down instead of lifting her up. She realized that no matter how much she loved him, her growth could no longer be contingent on his approval, his validation, or his success. She filed for divorce. The decision wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when she questioned whether she was being too harsh, too unforgiving. But deep down, Naomi knew it was the right choice. She had spent so many years trying to make it work with Jacob, trying to make him see her for who she truly was. But now, she needed to make space for herself, to grow, to thrive, to live life on her own terms. And so, Naomi moved forward. She poured herself into her work, her community projects, and her personal growth. She traveled, she met new people, and she continued to nurture the relationships that had always been important to her. She invested in herself, her mental health, her physical well-being, and her sense of purpose. The success of Whitaker Realty was no longer the defining factor of her life. Naomi had learned that the true measure of success wasn't in the balance sheets, the accolades, or the numbers on her bank account. It was in the way she had finally taken control of her own narrative, the way she had finally chosen herself. Naomi looked out over the city skyline from her new apartment, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. This was her life now, and it was more than she had ever dreamed of. She had walked away from a life that no longer served her, and in doing so, had found a sense of freedom she hadn't known was possible. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from one of her old friends, a text congratulating her on a recent achievement in her business ventures. Naomi smiled, her heart light with the knowledge that she had come so far, that she had done it on her own. And in that moment, she understood something that no one had ever told her. The most powerful choice she had ever made was to choose herself. Naomi stood in the center of the sprawling office, her reflection staring back at her from the polished glass windows that overlooked the city below. The view had always been a symbol of everything she had achieved: hard work, persistence, and a vision that had slowly begun to unfold into something extraordinary. The world beyond was bustling, full of life and opportunity. But inside, Naomi felt a deep, quiet tension. She had come so far, and yet, standing here, her mind kept circling back to one question. What now? Her phone buzzed on the desk, breaking her thoughts. It was a message from Jacob. I need to see you. It's important. Naomi stared at the message for a moment, feeling a strange mix of anger and sadness rise within her. After everything they had been through, his demands, his failures, his refusal to change, he still felt entitled to her attention, to her help. The truth was, Naomi had finally reached a place in her life where she was no longer willing to be the crutch Jacob leaned on whenever his world crumbled. She had learned to stand on her own, to own her choices, and she wasn't sure if there was room left in her life for the version of Jacob she had once loved. She had tried so hard for so many years to make their marriage work. But now, standing on the precipice of everything she had built for herself, Naomi knew that the time had come to make a decision. A decision that would not only change the course of her future, but would determine who she was and what kind of life she would lead moving forward. Jacob arrived at her office an hour later, his presence instantly filling the room. He looked much the same as he always did, well-dressed, confident, but with the unmistakable edge of frustration in his eyes. Naomi had always admired how effortlessly he had worn his confidence, how he had commanded a room with his presence alone. But now, all of that felt like a distant memory. The man she had once been captivated by had become a stranger to her, someone whose ambition had eclipsed everything she valued, including her. Naomi, Jacob began, his voice tight, but laced with an attempt at charm. Thank you for meeting with me. She nodded but didn't speak, waiting for him to continue. Jacob had always been the one to set the tone, but today, Naomi was determined to take control of the conversation. I've been thinking a lot, Jacob said, pacing slowly across the room, clearly nervous. About everything that's happened. About us? Naomi remained silent, studying him closely. She had no doubt that he had come here today with a specific agenda, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure what he wanted from her. Was it forgiveness? Was it some form of reconciliation? Or was he simply trying to salvage his image, trying to reassert his place in her life? I know things haven't been easy, Jacob continued, pausing in front of her. But Naomi, I need you to understand. I've been under a lot of pressure. The business hasn't been going well, and honestly, I've made mistakes. But I'm ready to change. I want to make things right between us. I need you. I'm not asking for much, just a chance to fix things. Naomi's heart raced as his words swirled around her. This was it, the moment she had been anticipating for weeks. She had known that Jacob would eventually come to her, that he would try to make amends. But now that the moment had arrived, she was no longer sure of what she wanted. His words felt familiar, just another version of the same promises he had made before. Promises that had always been empty. Naomi thought about everything she had sacrificed for him, everything she had given up in the hopes that they could build a life together. And yet, here she was, standing at the crossroads of her own life, having learned the hard way that Jacob had never been the man she had hoped he would be. He had always been too consumed by his own ego, his own need for validation, to see her as an equal partner. You're not asking for much? Naomi finally spoke, her voice steady but tinged with frustration. Jacob, you've been asking for everything, and I've given you everything. My time, my support, my energy, and for what? For you to continue tearing me down. For you to continue treating me like I'm here to fix your problems? Jacob's expression faltered, but he quickly masked it with a defensive stance. That's not fair, Naomi. You know that's not true. I've always wanted the best for you. You just want me to be your backup, she interrupted, stepping closer to him. You want me to be the one who always fixes things, who always comes to your rescue. But I'm not that person anymore. I'm not the woman who will continue to sacrifice her dreams, her growth, her happiness for someone who doesn't value me. Jacob's eyes hardened, but there was a flicker of something deeper, something that resembled the man she had once loved, the man she had hoped could change. Naomi, I've changed. I've learned from my mistakes. Please give me another chance. Naomi shook her head slowly. I've given you every chance, Jacob. I've waited for you to grow, to meet me halfway. But every time, I've been the one left carrying everything. I can't keep doing that. I can't keep sacrificing my future for someone who doesn't appreciate me. The silence between them hung thick in the air, and for a moment, Jacob said nothing. He just stood there, staring at Naomi as though trying to find a way to turn her words around, to make her see things his way. But Naomi had already made her decision. She had already spent too many years waiting for change that never came. "You've had your chances," Naomi said softly, her voice breaking slightly. "And I've had mine. I've learned so much about myself, about what I want in life. And the truth is, I can't keep putting my life on hold for you. I have to choose me. I have to choose the future I've been building for myself." Jacob's face fell, the anger and frustration evaporating, leaving behind a mixture of confusion and hurt. Are you saying this is over?" Naomi felt her heart clench at the finality in his voice, but she didn't flinch. "I think you've known this for a long time, Jacob. I've changed. I can't go back to the way things were. I'm not the woman who needs saving anymore." Jacob stood frozen, his eyes wide as he processed her words. Naomi watched him for a long moment, wondering if he would finally understand, if he would finally see her for who she had become. But all she saw was a man who had never truly seen her at all. "I'm sorry," Naomi whispered, the weight of the decision settling heavily on her chest. "But this is the only way forward for me." She turned and walked toward the door, not looking back. The door clicked softly behind her as she stepped into the hallway, her footsteps steady but filled with a quiet resolve. This was the moment she had been waiting for, her moment to reclaim her life, to choose herself above all else. Naomi didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in years, she felt at peace with her decision. She had made the climactic choice that would define the rest of her life, and it was one she knew she had to make, no matter how difficult. She had chosen herself. Naomi stood on the balcony of her new apartment, looking out over the city that had become the backdrop to her journey of transformation. The skyline stretched endlessly before her, a concrete jungle full of possibilities. And yet, as her eyes traced the outlines of the buildings, she couldn't help but reflect on the distance she had come. This wasn't just a new home. It was a new beginning, a life she had carved out for herself, one piece at a time. It had been months since the moment she had made the climactic decision to walk away from Jacob. The silence that had filled her life since then had been deafening at times. But in that silence, Naomi had found a freedom she hadn't known was possible. A freedom that wasn't just about the physical space between her and her past, but about the emotional space she had cleared. Room to grow, to heal, to embrace the woman she had become. Her decision to leave Jacob had been one of the hardest things she had ever done. There had been moments of doubt, moments where the weight of the choice had nearly crushed her. But those moments had been fleeting, overshadowed by the undeniable truth that she could no longer live for someone else's vision of who she should be. The future she was building was hers, and hers alone. Naomi's phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced down to see a message from her mother, Evelyn. "Just wanted to check in, sweetie. Are you okay? I'm so proud of you." Naomi smiled softly, the warmth in her chest undeniable. Her mother's support had been unwavering, even when Naomi had second-guessed her decisions. Evelyn had always been the one to remind her of her strength, of the quiet power that had carried Naomi through the most difficult times. And now, Naomi was finally learning to embrace that strength fully. She tapped out a quick reply. "I'm good, Mom. Really good. I'm finally living for me." The message sent, and Naomi took a deep breath, letting the cool breeze brush her skin. She had built this life brick by brick. The foundation had come from the years she had spent working at Whitaker Realty, transforming the company into something more than just a legacy of wealth. It had become a symbol of purpose. Her community projects were thriving, helping the underprivileged, giving opportunities to those who had been left behind. She had built a name for herself, not just as Thomas Whitaker's granddaughter, but as Naomi Hayes, a woman with her own vision and her own path. She had also found new friendships, relationships that weren't based on her family's wealth or her marriage to Jacob. She had reconnected with old college friends, women who had supported her when Jacob hadn't even been able to see her as more than an accessory. Naomi had started living for herself, not for anyone else's expectations. And she had discovered that it was the most fulfilling life she could have ever imagined. It wasn't long before Naomi's work reached a new level of recognition. She was invited to speak at conferences about sustainable development and social impact, her voice becoming one of authority in both the business world and the nonprofit sector. She had created programs that were changing lives, that were redefining what it meant to be a successful business owner. Success no longer meant financial gain alone. It was about creating something that mattered, something that gave back. Her focus shifted too. She no longer felt the need to prove herself to anyone. She wasn't trying to win Jacob's approval or anyone else's. She was focused on the people who believed in her, the ones who saw her for what she had always been: strong, capable, driven by a desire to make a real difference. She remembered the first time she had pitched her vision for community development at Whitaker Realty. The senior managers had been skeptical, but Naomi had stood her ground. Now, her vision had become a key part of the company's identity, attracting investors who saw the value in what she was building. It was a testament to the power of believing in something greater than just profit margins and business deals. It was about legacy in a much broader sense. But it wasn't just her professional life that had transformed. Naomi had started to date again. At first, she had been hesitant, afraid that opening her heart again would mean giving up the independence she had worked so hard to claim. But she had met Liam at a charity event, a fellow entrepreneur who shared her passion for social justice and sustainable business practices. He was kind, understanding, and patient, never pushing her or trying to mold her into something she wasn't. With him, Naomi had learned that love didn't have to be about sacrifice. It could be about growth, mutual respect, and shared values. The idea of starting over with someone else had once felt impossible, but now it felt natural. Naomi had learned that her worth wasn't dependent on anyone else's validation, and that included romantic partners. She had spent so much of her life thinking she needed to be a supporting character in someone else's story. But now, Naomi was the lead in her own. A few weeks later, Naomi sat at her desk in the new office she had moved into, a sleek, modern space that reflected her newfound sense of self. The walls were adorned with art from local artists, a subtle reminder of the community she had helped to build. She took a moment to reflect on everything she had accomplished, everything she had fought for. The room was filled with light, the view once again stretching out before her. The city was no longer just a backdrop. It was a canvas. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Liam. She smiled to herself, the warmth in her chest spreading as she answered. "Hey," she said, her voice light. "What's up?" "I was thinking," Liam said, his voice full of excitement. "We should go away for the weekend. You've been working nonstop, and I think you deserve a break. Let's get out of here. Just the two of us." Naomi laughed, feeling a sense of contentment she hadn't realized she was missing. "That sounds perfect. I'd love that." As they made plans, Naomi realized that life had become more than just the absence of Jacob, more than just escaping the past. It had become a journey of discovery. She was not just a woman who had left a marriage behind. She was a woman who had learned to stand on her own, to create a life that was hers and hers alone. When the call ended, Naomi sat back in her chair, her mind drifting back to all the steps that had led her to this point. There had been moments of doubt, of pain, but each one had taught her something valuable. She had learned that strength wasn't about never falling. It was about getting back up time and time again. And now, Naomi was finally living the life she had always dreamed of, a life she had built from the ground up, brick by brick. There would be challenges ahead, no doubt, but she was no longer afraid. She had already overcome so much. As the sun set over the city, Naomi felt the weight of the past finally lifting, replaced by a quiet, powerful peace. She was ready for whatever came next, because she knew, without a doubt, that she was strong enough to face it, whatever it might be. This was her new beginning, and she was finally free.